and it seems Trump is eyeing off pharmaceuticals for similar treatment. The Shadow Minister for Trade, Kevin Hogan, is here tonight. He reckons his side could have struck a deal to stop those tariffs. Michael Stutchbury's readers at the Financial Review are keeping a close eye on the fracturing of this relationship. Amelia Lester is a dual Australian-US citizen. She's just been back in America for her work at Foreign Policy magazine. And a trade war could have serious implications for Treasurer Daniel Mookhey's home state of New South Wales. Welcome to Q&A. Hello, I'm Patricia Carvelis. I want to pay my respects to the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, on whose land we're broadcasting from here tonight in Sydney. Remember, you can live stream us around the country, iView, all the socials, Quandra is the hashtag, and we'd love for you to get involved. Before we start formally, former Labor Senator Doug Cameron wants the government to scrap the AUKUS subs deal with America. So it makes me want to ask this question quickly to all of you. Is it dead, Stutchbury?
Is the AUKUS agreement dead?
Yep.
Oh, no way. I think it would be.
No way?
No way. Of course, you're getting a wave of sort of anti-AUKUS sentiment from parts of the left, if you like. But the ANZUS has been the bedrock of Australian security for, as you say, for 80 years. It would be an act of national self-harm to, sure, there's a big disruptive force in the White House, maybe dismantling the post-war order, the rules-based order, but Australia needs to cling on to the American alliance because that's really what's kept the peace in the Asia-Pacific. And you said in your lead-up that we've given things to the US and we've fought in their wars, but the American alliance and its security umbrella has really allowed the prosperity, the peace in the Asia-Pacific region, which has allowed Australia to become the really prosperous nation it has.
OK. Treasurer?
No, it's not dead. AUKUS has predated the Trump administration. It will survive the Trump administration, and it's in Australia's national interest for it to do so. I'd simply point out that Australia is doing what Trump is demanding of Europe. That is, we are taking responsibility for our own defence, we are investing in our own capability, we are using it as an opportunity to spark a renaissance in manufacturing here in the UK and in Australia. This is something which benefits very strongly all three countries. That's why its dynamics are strong enough to survive the headwinds that might be coming out of any particular administration at any particular point in time.
Amelia?
AUKUS is a deal between Australia, the US and the UK. The US is getting plenty out of this deal too. Trump knows how to make a deal, and I think there's some arguments to be made that Australia's getting not a great deal out of it, which makes me think he'll keep it up.
OK, that's a point a former Prime Minister has made. Kevin?
Look, I think AUKUS will outlive Trump's presidency, and I think it'll outlive Albanese's prime ministership and future presidents and prime ministers. I think it'll go down in history as one of the great achievements of the coalition government from 13 to 22, getting the AUKUS deal done. This is about national security. I think we get a lot out of the deal. It's a really important, the technology that we get access to, really important to our national defence, and I think it'll survive. OK, well, let's stay on the topic of AUKUS with a question from Siobhan Jabor. Hi, Siobhan.
Should we ask for our money back now Trump has pocketed our money for the AUKUS agreement and imposed tariffs?
Should get our money back.
No, I don't think we should get our money back. I think it's a great investment. This has bipartisan support as well. I think we always talk as politicians that the biggest job we have is national security. We need to keep our country safe, and I think this is one of the best deals I think this is the best deal we can get around the world. It's to the most advanced technology. We're going to get given a technological gift from the US in this. Only two countries will have access to it, the UK and Australia, as well as the US, who have developed it. It's very important to our national security.
Sure, but that's just the AUKUS. The question actually included the tariff decision. So I think that's the... No, just to... Yeah. That nexus, that they've slapped these tariffs on us.
OK, look, I think the tariff decision...
But we paid a down payment, didn't we?
So to the tariffs, I believe it's bad policy. I believe what Donald Trump has decided to do with tariffs will hurt his own economy, and I think it will hurt the global economy. And I think it's a bad deal for everybody. And we have been telling him that very loudly. That being said, AUKUS, I think, will transcend that. I think it's... and it's more than just economics and the money that's going around for the technology. This is about national security. This is very important for Australia's security. As I say, the most important thing is keeping the country safe. There's evil in the world, right? We see that all the time. Every day there's bad things happening. And to keep peace, you have to, if you want peace, you have to always be prepared for war. It's the same that goes back to the Roman times.
Amelia, the question, though, did talk about pocketing our money and then slapping tariffs on us. That's the issue I think a lot of Australians are expressing frustration with.
Yeah, I think it's hard to get your money back from Donald Trump. He has been bankrupt 6 times, and I don't think he's going to give us the money back. But let's step back for a minute and think about why we got into this deal in the first place. China has the world's biggest navy. It has a shipbuilding capacity that's something like 270 times bigger than the United States, which is why the US wants $5 billion from Australia to boost that. And China is catching up to the US in the Indo-Pacific. Now, right now, its submarines are noisy, and it doesn't have nearly as many of them as the US does. And the US sees an opportunity in going into that alliance with Australia to shore up its position in a great power competition with China in the Indo-Pacific. But Australia needs to ask some questions that relate to its own national security, like, does it need nuclear-powered submarines rather than diesel ones to protect Australia? Or are we even going to get the subs? I mean, Elbridge Colby, who is a senior advisor of Trump's, has talked about nuclear-powered submarines as a crown jewel in the American military infrastructure. They may not want to give them up in the end. So there are questions that Australia needs to ask that are separate from what the US wants out of the deal.
Well, former Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull made it very clear what he thought of the AUKUS deal today. Here he is in Canberra.
We will have lost both sovereignty and security and a lot of money as well. So that's why I say it is a really bad deal. So people say, will Donald Trump like it? Well, of course he'd like it. It's such a bad deal for us. His only thing would be back of his mind, he'll be thinking, who are these dumb guys that agreed to this deal?
Would he be thinking that our dumb guys agreed to this deal?
I think Australia, going to the question as well, that Australia's always policy has been to not try to separate trade policy and defence and security policy. And we're in Trump is sparking a global trade war of which so far we've just been hit just a little bit. We haven't been singled out. It's probably going to get bigger and it's probably going to get sort of worse as a bad thing. But it's always been Australian policy to try and separate the two. Doesn't mean that there's not serious issues about the AUKUS deal itself that should be pursued. It was brought up very quickly by the Morrison government. Labor stuck to it very quickly as well. They didn't want to get any separation on foreign policy. So there are serious issues to discuss and to push and to make sure it goes the way we are. And it also means, I think, that Australia needs to do more in other areas, such as defence arrangements with other countries in the region, such as Japan and Korea. And we probably need to spend more on national security and defence.
Our next question comes from Brent Patterson. Hi, Brent.
Hi. There's a lot of talk about how countries like Australia are feeling about Trump's tariffs, but none are asking why the US sentiments have changed so radically. The US has an administration that believes they've been funding the world with a generosity for at least 75 years, and they can't afford it anymore. The sanctimonious and entitled response by world leaders is not helping. For Australia, Rudd, as our ambassador, is not helping either. Should we just replace Rudd, express gratitude for America's help for the last many decades, and put forward how Australia has supported the US perhaps better than any other country in the world for the last 75 years?
Should we just replace Rudd and all of those other ideas, Amelia?
I've heard it said that, look, Rudd has said some not very nice things about Trump on the record.
Well,
I think he called him a village idiot and other things. But I would remind everyone that Trump's own Vice President, J.D. Vance, called him America's Hitler and called him reprehensible. So clearly Trump has a pretty short memory when it comes to these kinds of things, which is why I wouldn't be inclined to say that it disqualifies Kevin Rudd from that position. But to the question more generally, I think one important component here is that there's one thing that Trump's ideological on. Everything else is flexible, but he's always been ideological on tariffs. That dates back to the 80s when he put an ad in the New York Times saying that the US was getting an unfair deal. He's not going to budge on this, and there's evidence that this time around, he tried it in his first administration, he's going to go faster, he's going to go stronger, and he's not going to relent the way he did then, not least because he's not running for office again.
So you don't think he would do a deal with Australia regardless?
I think he feels really strongly that America's been ripped off, and I think he thinks that this is the one thing that could be his legacy, his means of course correcting.
Yeah, I think it would be a serious mistake for any Australian government to dismiss Kevin Rudd. And I say that because 4 weeks ago I had the opportunity to go to Washington and work with Mr Rudd on part of Australia's response to some of the challenges that we're having. And I saw for myself how relentless his energy is, but also how well connected he is to every single major power centre that applies in the United States. Whether you're walking the corridors of Capitol Hill or if you're on Wall Street meeting with some of the serious financial power brokers in the world economy, they all know him, they all respect him. The reason why is what he has that is unique is that he, apart from being a former Prime Minister, he's one of the few people who is a genuine expert in Chinese leadership as much as he's an expert in American leadership, let alone Australia's national interest. Which other Australian brings together those three qualities? Which other Australian can do what he can? And I say that because seeing him deploy those relationships, those power in our national interest can't be replaced. And I think that, again, he's a massive asset for the country. As for what is driving Donald Trump, I think Mr Trump is wrong about trade. I think that to the extent to which he has a diagnosis about trade hollowing out US manufacturing, it's not true in fact, but equally, even if you believe it is true, his policies will simply lead to more unemployment in America. And it's bad for US workers as much as it is bad for New South Wales workers, as it is bad for Australian workers. And I do think that as the consequences of cutting off the US from the world play out, he will have to answer for the success of his policies, not the sincerity of his grievance.
Yeah, I think Kevin Rudd's a very well qualified and energetic former Prime Minister. He's totally legitimate for Australia. Australian government decide he should be the ambassador to Washington. So I don't think the government should back off on all of that. If there's a change of government, there'll be someone from a Liberal stripes in there who'll probably do a good job as well. On the tariff thing, Trump's got trade policy and tariffs for a number of measures. One is to bash countries around, like over fentanyl coming in from Canada and Mexico. Wants to raise revenue because he's got a massive government budget deficit, and he's thinking he's going to raise revenue out of it as like a tax on imports. And thirdly, he says that China has got an unbalanced economy, which there's some truth in, and that has suppressed Chinese consumption and taken out US industrialisation. But it is a real contradiction of the Trump agenda, which now we're seeing playing out, which could bring the whole agenda down. It's inflationary. You're starting to see a lot of uncertainty in American business, and it could well bring his agenda down. So let's just see how this all plays out.
Brent, why do you want to see Kevin Rudd go? You've heard quite a defence of his... I mean, he's well known not to sleep, so I don't know anyone who'd be hustling in Washington quite at his level.
Look, he's very bright, he's very capable, and everything that the panel said is true, and I agree with. Perhaps a little bit more complexity in there, but having a ambassador who is quickly deleting tweets, criticizing Donald Trump perhaps unprofessionally is not something that is really conducive to a strong relationship with the US, and particularly a person like Trump. That's why I asked the question.
I'll say something quick. I think we've all told our teenagers anything you put on social media is always there, and deleting them doesn't make them go away. So maybe Rudd should have been more careful. But look, I want to make the point here that there is a good story here in that both the opposition and the government are agreeing that tariffs are bad and that we should not retaliate. And I think that's a Team Australia position, which I think is good. But I would comment that Rudd was Albanese's captain's pick. I just want to make a quick comment on that too, because I think they're not handling the situation as well as they could. PK, you and I a couple of weeks ago spoke an afternoon briefing. Trump is a transactional leader-to-leader operator, and I'm personally disappointed that Albanese has not made the effort, like a lot of other leaders, to travel to Washington. I'm not saying he would have got the exemption, but he needs to start a personal relationship with Trump. He can't hide behind, bureaucrats, diplomats and whatever. He has to develop a leader-to-leader relationship. He once said publicly, as you know, that Trump scares the shit out of him. That's not the attitude we want either. We want him to be sitting with him, to be putting Australia's case to him. We've had a good relationship with America. We all believe that Trump's decision is bad on the tariffs.
You say Team Australia, but why do you keep mentioning what he said ages ago?
Because I think it was a mistake and I think he needs to get over it. And I think his actions, is he still? Because his actions say he, nearly 5 months on, has not made the effort like every other member of the Quad, the other member of AUKUS, to go and see him. Trump is a transactional leader-to-leader deal maker. So I think our leader needs to be in the game. What's his plan to do before April the 2nd? We have more tariffs that may come in on April the 2nd. What's Albanese's plan? Is his plan to go over there and chat to him and have a talk like he should? Because that's exactly what he should be doing.
Well, can I just say, right, if the coalition's and the alternative national government's policy here is that what is required is a charm offensive, then I don't think the answer is Peter Dutton either.
Well, he's not scared of him.
I would simply say that if what Kevin is saying is true, then why hasn't the UK been exempted from tariffs? Because we saw Keir Starmer do exactly what Kevin said should have happened. And we've seen our government take a slightly different approach. And I would simply say, as Amelia's pointed out, for Trump, this is ideological. And I think that the diagnosis that this is purely motivated by his personal views is a Trump 2016 view. It's not a Trump 2024 view. This second administration is far more serious, far more organised, far more determined to apply US leverage. I don't think that charm offensive approach will work.
Do you agree with your industry minister that it was a dog act?
Yeah, I certainly think that the US policy was not in keeping at all in the nature of our relationship with the US, and I do think it was a dog act. And I also think for the case of New South Wales, I think it's a problem for us because we as a state and we as a nation, we make our money by selling the intelligence of our people to the world. Australia, we produce 3 times our per capita global economic share. We need to sell to the world. We have so many jobs here in New South Wales that turn on markets being open to our goods. So whether it's the US or China or anyone else who slams the door, we should call it out.
Our next question comes from Arthur Rorris. Hi, Arthur.
Hi, Patricia. We've been asked by our government to buy Australian in response to the friendly fire we are copping from the Trump administration. That's great if you are buying Bega cheese and Bundy rum. But you can't buy a railway, a power station or a hospital at the supermarket. As taxpayers, we entrust our government to buy the steel, the aluminium and the other materials to do that. If we are not going to impose tariffs on the Americans, why can't we at least defend Australian jobs by buying and insisting on a mandate that all Australian governments must buy Australian-made steel?
It's a really interesting question. Michael Stutchbury, mandating. Do you think that it should happen?
No, I wouldn't do that. I think why we're not retaliating is because we don't have much leverage. We don't export a lot to the US. We don't have a lot that we can penalise the US for. And if we did, we'd just put up our cost structure and we'd make ourselves less competitive.
Well, our own consumers would be hit, right?
And we'd hit our own consumers. So it would hurt us. The Buy Australia thing can be, it's not a bad thing in itself. Some patriotism and encouraging Australians to get behind and just go into in the supermarket and whatever and buy things. But if you're buying something like steel, which costs more than the world market that you can get elsewhere, you're putting up your cost structure, and it means other parts of your industry become less competitive. What we really need to be able to do now is not try to put penalties, is to retaliate. We need to get our cost structure down, become more competitive, become agile, and find other markets in the world by competing more strongly, as Australia did pretty well when China imposed quite bigger so far trade coercion against Australia during the pandemic. So a Buy Australia policy can end up being a bit protectionist, of which Australia learned a big lesson that protection just pushes up our costs, puts penalties on our efficient export markets. We need industries that can stand on their own 2 feet and export to the world.
OK, that's not what I think federal Labor's looking at a Buy Australia policy.
Well, you can buy Australia if you're a patriot, but you can also buy Australia if you want world-class steel. And we talk down the quality of our steel industry. But BlueScope Steel in the Illawarra does an amazing job of producing steel for renewable energy, but also for trains. And what we want to do as a new government, relatively new government here in New South Wales, is we are adopting a policy that says we are looking to buy steel from Australia. We're looking to buy aluminium with Australia. We equally are wanting to use our purchasing power to put Australia into global supply chains, yes, using train manufacturing. We are about to replace the fleet that people use to get to work and to get home. We do think this is a good opportunity, but we thought that before the tariffs were there. And we think that opportunity that tariffs give us is to allow us also to make the point that is also a sound response to the policies that the Trump administration's put in place.
Now, Arthur, you're actually the Secretary of the South Coast Labor Council and the member of the Labor Party too. I think you represent workers at BlueScope Steel in Port Kembla, right?
Amongst others.
Yeah, yeah. And what are they saying? And they must be very concerned about the tariffs.
Well, look, in the last 25 years, we've heard the arguments with respect about cost. Let me just give you one fact that shows why that doesn't work with respect. The current spot price for steel in America is about $930. It's about the same here. Do you know what it is in China that we're competing with? $450. If we can't match $450 on a cost basis, we lose our steel industry. We either have a steel industry and look after not just our economy, but our national security, or we don't. America mandates, China mandates, the EU effectively mandates. They can't all be wrong. Why is Australia the only one that says, oh no, we can't do that, we've got to go on cost?
Kevin?
Well, I think there's two issues, I think, coming up here. One is, you're talking about procurement as one thing, like let's buy Australia. I think, just to go back to the supermarket examples, it was one thing we pushed as Nats. We really wanted country of origin labelling on everything so people were aware of what they were doing and where they were buying. We thought that was important. But back to your examples, I touch a bit on what Michael said. We need to be made cost effective. So, that comes down to a whole lot of other government policies because we need to be able to do things as cheaply as we can. We're an expensive country to do things. But where I think we get into a problem if we start to do reciprocal type things is trade is driving we are a good exporter as well, and exports are driving our nation's wealth right now. 1 in 4 jobs directly related to a trade industry, an exporting industry. So if you look at companies who support them, it's more than that. They're higher paying jobs on average as well. So also all the major exports of our country, I'm just going to give regional Australia a plug here, coal, iron ore, gas and food, or ag, all from the regions. And at $650 billion last year, and it's driving our economic wealth. So we've got to be careful when we start talking about, okay, we're going to put in some policies that are going to make Australia, you know what I'm saying. I get procurement, and we should have, and governments do. I'm sure Daniel does at the state level as well.
Would you like to see more mandates in terms of government procurement?
I think mandates is an interesting word, but I think we should have more policies about Australia First procurement. But how we do that, we need to be careful that we don't want to be seen to be retaliating with tariff-type impositions because our exports are funding our country.
So governments like Daniel's are deep in debt. They need to do things that are cost-effective. They need to get the cheapest materials they can. If China is dumping into the Australian market or below the cost of production, we've got anti-dumping measures that can and are taken against them. As well, but if we go for cheaper steel wherever we get it, we can reduce the cost of things like housing, which is a big problem as well.
Well, what can I say? Look, the previous government did buy in New South Wales, did buy a lot of its steel from China as part of its infrastructure program. I'm going to tell you, I'm spending a lot of my time having to fix a lot of those deals that are costing us a lot of money because they're late. The financing costs are going up. They're not of the same quality. We're having to pay to adapt them to Australian standards anyway. And so this is the point. You can look at it at the simple point in which you sign the contract, or you need to look at it at whole of life of the actual project. And what we're learning as a state government is when it does come to things like trains, once you factor in everything you pay, having local manufacturing is really helpful when, for example, trains break and you need to repair them. The fact that you can bring in the same sort of steel, that rather than having to ship it from the other side of the world, is actually a real cost saving. So I'm making the point that you can want to buy Australian steel because you think it's the patriotic thing to do. You can not want to buy it because you don't think it's retaliatory. We as a state government are looking to buy more of it because it actually saves us money and it props up jobs as well. It's a win-win in that scenario if we get it right.
Amelia, what I'm hearing here is there seems to be broadly, I think Bill Shorten was one of the only voices that talked about retaliation in terms of tariffs in the future, but there does appear to be a real push in Australia at the moment for that kind of do things here, build here. Is that the way you think lots of countries are going to pivot?
Yeah, it's really hard to know what to do in this situation because if you look at the countries that have had these tariffs inflicted on them so far, it's kind of been a 50-50 split as to whether they retaliate with their own tariffs. So you've had Brazil and the UK, South Korea, they said they're not going to do anything. Then you've got Europe and obviously Canada very vocally on the other side saying they're going to slap retaliatory tariffs on US imports. I think that the problem with the idea of retaliating is that we don't know where Trump's going to go next. So far, he's just lobbed these tariffs on one industry in Australia, but there's every indication that he's going to continue and maybe go more broadly. And so countries that are laying low and maybe staying out of the limelight with him, that might be a good strategy. I wanted to add also that I don't think that kind of personal diplomacy gesture is working the way it did in his first administration.
Right, to Kevin's point about turning up.
Yeah, I wanted to just mention that Milei in Argentina, for instance, has really gone on a charm offensive with Trump because he's got a lot of industries that he really depends on the US for imports, and at least he imports a lot of beef into the US. And he gave Elon Musk a chainsaw on the stage at the Conservative Political Action Conference recently. He's really been trying hard.
Here's a chainsaw.
There's still no indication that that charm offensive is going to get him any kind of exemption. The carve-outs are just not happening this time around.
OK, no chainsaws from us. Our next question tonight comes from Amy Robson.
Hi. I'm concerned that more tariffs are coming, particularly in pharmaceuticals. If Australia does choose to avoid retaliatory tariffs, what practical options do we have?
Amelia?
Oh my goodness, that's a big question. I think that Michael was onto the right idea when he said we've just got to look for other trading partners. The problem is that anyone who thinks that they know what Trump's going to do or says they know what he's going to do is wrong. I do think that he's got an ideological fervour around this issue that wasn't there first time around. You just have to look at the fact that in the first administration it took him 2 years to impose tariffs. This time he did it in the first 30 days. So I think that we do need to start thinking about Plan B, just as Europe, for instance, is aggressively thinking about Plan B for its own security. This is trade, security, these things are all up for grabs now.
That's really interesting. The question, though, about what's next, pharmaceuticals appears to be I've heard lots of people talking about that being next. Is that a sort of red line for us, Kevin? I mean, if they come after the pharmaceuticals, we're just collectively going to go nuts as a country?
Well, I think the mood will be interesting to watch, but I think Trump is doing himself damage with other international countries, foreign relationships. I think he's doing himself damage, and I think eventually he'll do himself economic damage. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. I think for us, I'm a strong free trade believer. It's interesting when you look at Australian political history. At Federation, it was a free traders versus the protectionists. This was the issue for a long time. I think, over the last 40 years that when we've really embraced trade, that it has been a great bonanza for us. We make a lot of money. I mean, we can see what we don't make, and that's a shame, but, what we sell and the amounts we sell it in is just an economic bonanza. So I think our strategy is still, if they do go wider, I think our strategy should not to be retaliate with tariffs, but I think we need to get a group of countries who've done really well out of the world order of trade, the rules-based order. There'd be countries like the UK, like Japan, like South Korea, who've made a lot of money out of the trading system and how it is, similar size economies to us, and we need to protect the system. And I think how that plays out yet, I'm not sure, but we need to form relationships with those type of countries, keep our tariffs low, keep trading with each other at least. And I think over time it'll show that the tariffs aren't working.
Yeah, the pharmaceuticals is a bit like the second round of of the aluminium and steel, it's suggested, we won't know, pharmaceuticals and maybe beef, of which we would get hit under this like everybody else. And the particular Australian glitch on this is the Pharmaceutical Benefit Scheme, whereby the government in Australia is the monopoly buyer or the monopsonist buying drugs from the rest of the world, including from the big American and European drug manufacturers. And by buying on behalf of all Australians, the government keeps the price down and keeps the price of medicines down in Australia. The Americans have never liked that.
And on both sides of politics, right? Because Big Pharma is very influential there and they want to get rid of this.
Yeah, and in the US, it's a Big Pharma thing, though, obviously, and it's a transfer of what you might call a bit of drug company rents from the manufacturers to the consumers in Australia. I think Australia will stand up to that. I don't think any government would dismantle the Pharmaceutical Benefits Scheme because of the reciprocal tariffs, which are another thing again. From April 2, they're supposed to come in, and this is probably the big one, where Trump supposedly will look at everything they don't like in every country and demand reciprocal treatment. But I think Australia will stand up to that.
We will not be moving on the Pharmaceutical Benefits Scheme. And in fact, Mike, you may well remember we had that carved out as part of the FTA with the US, and they recognised it and respected it.
Yes, I think it would be very, very weird politics, wouldn't it, to be messing with it? Like, what would that look like if you were to?
The Pharmaceutical Benefits Scheme is here to stay forever.
And why is it? Just explain what would actually happen, seriously. It would be political Armageddon for you to touch on.
I mean, drugs would go from $6 to $600. Yeah. And more.
Yeah. They certainly would. I know many of you have come tonight because you're really engaged in this question about our relationship with America. Now, we've had a kind of different views on the panel, but broadly a view, especially when it comes to defence, that we need to try and keep the relationship going. But I want to see if I can just get a show of hands from you. If some of these guys have convinced you, do you feel like we're breaking up with America? Put your hand up if you do. Oh, there's a lot of people breaking up with the US here, although I still think keep your hands up, right? Right, I reckon it's about half the room. What do you think, Kevin?
I think it's about 30%.
30%?
30 to 40.
Look at that. OK, the minority of the room. But for those keeping their hands up very high, I'd love to hear from you about why this is such an important issue. Let me see. Down here I see a hand. You had your hand up, didn't you? Yeah. We'll get a mic over to you. I just want to get a sense of why you think we should break up with the US, so to speak.
Oh.
It's all right, the mic will just be there.
I just happen to be from there, and...
You're trying to break up with your own country.
And I am just trying to break up with it myself, so...
Why is that?
So many reasons.
But you are not happy with the direction the US is taking?
Not particularly, no. And I just think that the government, especially the immaturity and way that our government is presenting themselves to the rest of the world is really embarrassing. So personally, I'll be breaking up with the US.
So you'll be breaking up. We're still having a conversation about it here tonight. We've got another comment over here. You had your hand up too. Yep. You, and in fact, not that all hands are equal, but yours was fired up, really. I noticed. And how are you feeling about the relationship?
Well, I just want to see Australia autonomous. I've never understood why Australia as a country hasn't taken a stand in the world. We have so much here. We have, a variety of cultures. We have vast mineral resources, etc. And here we are, really trying to hang on to something. And geographically, the US is so far away. We need to build our relationships with our neighbours.
It's an interesting point, and one we hear a lot, Treasurer. If you look at a lot of the surveys, I wrote about one today, there is frustration with the Trump administration and a change, I think, going on.
Yeah, well, I should just confess, I would not have voted for Donald Trump.
Stop it.
But I would also observe that if we were having this conversation 10 years ago when President Obama was in the White House, it was a very different conversation. And I think we should also just make the point that should there be a change in US government, should we see a return to an Obama-like figure or an Obama-like administration, I think Australian public opinion would change pretty fast, which is the point, which is you don't set your strategy according to the personality of a person in the White House at any one point in time.
But it's about the policies of that person, right?
Sure, and I think, therefore, our response has to be proportionate to policies we disagree with. The other point I'd simply say is I do think Australia does a great job of relations with our neighbours. I do think we are a respected voice. I do think we have a lot to speak to the world and a lot to point to the world. And I think, frankly, the PBS is a good example of how we've rejected that sort of dog-eat-dog capitalism approach to the US, and we come up with something better. I think we should take this as an opportunity to tell more people about it.
We're going to keep our cheap drugs, I reckon, after seeing this panel. If you're just joining us, you're watching Q&A with Kevin Hogan, Amelia Lester, Daniel Mookhey and Michael Stutchbury. Next, we'll hear from Jamie Wang.
Thank you. What does the imposition of tariffs mean for the China and Australia relationship? Will we see a continued export reliance of trade on China in the foreseeable future?
We've actually got Diana Musina, who's the Deputy Chief Economist at AMP, in the audience as an expert for us. So I'd love to just take that straight to you, Diana, in terms of the relationship with China and the economic implications for us.
Well, obviously China is our largest trading partner. They take about a third of our exports, and we import about 25% of our imports come from China. The biggest hit to Australia via the China relationship is more indirect. So say the tariffs that the US is imposing on China hurts the Chinese economy. That will mean that their growth slows and that they demand less things from us, iron ore, coal, LNG and services in particular, which is mainly what they import from Australia. But I think I take a more optimistic approach to this because I think that there are many offsets that can be worked around in this situation because China has no inflation. Actually, it's in deflation right now. They can stimulate their economy. They can cut interest rates much further. They can do much more fiscal spending, and they are doing that. They've just been a bit slower than the markets would like them to be. But even over the weekend, they announced more policies that are going targeted towards the consumer. So China has a lot more options up its sleeve to try and stimulate its economy, even in the face of very high tariffs. And I think that they will grow at 5% like they want to this year. I mean, compare that to Australia, which is growing at 1%, 1.5%. US to Europe is 1% or even lower. They are still growing at a very fast pace and they have options.
That's really interesting. Amelia?
Yeah, geopolitically, I think also China sees an opportunity here with the abdication of American leadership globally. It's really leaning into the trade war. There was some rhetoric used, something like we're going to fight to the end. It meant that I think they're sort of spoiling for a fight here. And then they've also been taking some interesting moves of their own. They slapped some tariffs on Canada, presumably just to try and pressure Canada to not follow the US's lead in upping its tariffs on Chinese goods. So I think it's interesting that they see both an economic opportunity and a geopolitical one. I've also seen reporting that indicates that the whole David versus Goliath narrative that's taken root in Canada and Mexico, for instance, and led to this surge of nationalist pride is not happening in China. People are largely frustrated with the economy and the lack of growth, and this could perhaps compound some domestic internal problems.
Michael?
Yeah, I think the issue now with China is what is Trump's plan on the geopolitics and the security? Is he now saying with regards to Ukraine, is it really about saying to Europe, you have to look after this? America has protected the free world for too long. You've got to pay for your security and deal with Vladimir Putin. So he can then deal with China, which is the geostrategic conflict between the new rising superpower. And he wants to do that and keep China in its place a bit. Or is he saying, this is a sphere of influence and we're going to let the Russians have their sphere of influence and America's going to have our sphere of influence and we're going to take Greenland and we're going to take the Panama Canal and we're going to take Canada as well, and that's going to be our sphere of influence, and really then let the Chinese have their sphere of influence. And does that mean then that China would then move on Taiwan and you get the whole issue of all of that? Is that what, I think that's the big question that no one really knows the answer to.
So if that is the scenario, because you're right, that is the big question, where does that leave us?
Well, we want to keep the Americans engaged. We certainly don't want to have a situation where China becomes much more powerful in the region and takes Taiwan and in a position to really bully its partners, as it tried to bully us over the trade disputes. We don't want to see that happening. So we want to keep the Americans engaged. we want to have, but we don't want them to get too aggressive. We'd rather keep it as a thing where we can keep the Americans as our defence guarantee and the Chinese as a big export market. At the same time, we need to diversify away a bit from China, as we did when we had the trade coercion on lobsters and wine and such.
Yeah, where a deal was done, right? We got those, and we dealt with that period. It's an interesting point Stutch makes about the sphere of influence. That is the big theory at the moment, isn't it? That's what they're kind of carving up the world, which makes a country like us rather nervous, Kevin Hogan. You must be feeling a little nervous.
Well, there's a lot of moving parts, PK. But just did the tariff issue first, and I'll come to the national security implications. I think I'd like to be optimistic about China and growth post these tariffs, but I think it will depend on the retaliation of how many countries retaliate. I think if there's a lot of countries retaliate, like China and many others, I think the world growth will sink significantly, which will have huge impacts on China. So I hope that's not the case, which is why we'll be selling the non-retaliatory story. But then this takes us back to AUKUS. And so with spheres...
All roads back to AUKUS.
When we're talking about spheres of influence, I think, again, this is the reason, and I personally, Daniel raised the issue before, I think AUKUS will outlive President Trump. I think it will outlive Prime Minister Albanese and Prime Minister Starmer. I think this is a really important national security deal for us, and that's why it's important right now.
OK, we have a question now from Susan Fuchs.
Is New South Wales broke?
Well, I got to say, when I became Treasurer and they gave me the incoming brief, I asked that question as well, I have to say. But look, I would simply say that New South Wales is under real financial pressure, namely because the previous government, rightly in my view, spent a lot of money to save the state and save a lot of jobs during the pandemic. But that wasn't free. And that did mean that we as a government inherited the most amount of debt of any incoming New South Wales government in history. We have had to recalibrate a lot of how we've managed the state in order to respond to that situation. What certainly hurt New South Wales was the fact that we did get a big shock on our GST income last year. The state did lose about $12.6 billion in GST income. That otherwise means that this year I would have been reporting a return to surplus. I'm not doing that. But what we're having to do is, we have to make a lot of hard choices now to make sure that we can manage the COVID debt, keep the economy growing, look after households, pay our essential workers well, and equally make sure the state is making the critical investments we have to do. Every state's having to do that. Victoria's facing trouble, Queensland's facing trouble, Tasmania's facing trouble. That is something which all state treasurers are having to respond to. But that is also the reasons why we are being very careful with every dollar we're spending, and we are taking steps to reduce the debt. By the end of this particular financial year, it will be about $9 billion lower than it would have otherwise had been if the previous government had gotten re-elected.
Michael Stutchbury, that GST deal where WA is living their best lives really under that deal, it seems locked in largely because of politics. Yeah,
politics has meant that in the fiscal horizontal equalisation, if a state has a mining boom like Western Australia, they have to give up some of that wealth to the rest of the country. Now, you can agree or disagree with that as to whether that's a good thing or not, but they have to give it up. They have to give up so much under the formula that it was politically untenable for both sides of politics. So they gave them a special deal. That means the others complain, so they give others people. I'd say New South Wales is not as broke as Queensland or particularly Victoria, which is sort of broke, but all the states and the arrangements, the federal-state relations, have allowed the states to borrow, I think, excessively over the last 20-odd years, and there hasn't been enough coordination of borrowing and the growth of governments over this period of time. What we do need is to have genuine tax reform and federal-state financial relations reform, such as bad taxes, such as stamp duty, which the states still rely on. There needs to be a reform of that involving the states and the feds.
OK, our next question comes from Beck Devine in Victoria.
In the midst of tariff wars and ongoing unpredictability since Trump 2.0, a number of economists have speculated the United States could be heading towards a recession. If this were to occur, it would likely impact the Australian economy negatively. Given a large proportion of our superannuation investments are tied to American companies, what measures need to be put in place to protect the retirement savings of our ageing population, especially within the current cost of living climate?
Deanna Messina, I want to bring you in there because it's a great question, and I know many people relying on their superannuation are very nervous at the moment.
So the first thing is, just because the US goes into recession doesn't mean that Australia goes into a recession. Actually, in the post-inflation targeting era, post the 1980s, we have managed to have less up and down cycles compared to the US because of the way that the Reserve Bank basically manages our economy to price stability and full employment. So that's one part to keep in mind. The second one, though, is the impact to financial markets. And the US has a massive overweight to the impact in share markets, mainly because it has some of the best companies around the world in it. So yes, when the US share market falls, Australia does tend to follow. US shares are down by about 10%, if not a little bit more, peak to trough. I mean, there are a few up and down days. You know, the share market doesn't fall just at 10% in one go. That is over a number of weeks. And Australia has fallen by a similar amount. Other countries like Europe is actually doing a bit better because of speculation that Europe is going to have some fiscal spending and defence as well. So Europe is outperforming. So we are likely to be in a period of more volatility this year. And ultimately, it's up to the fund managers to try and manage the volatility and to expect what the outcomes are going to be around tariffs, which is why economists and analysts are obsessed with forecasts of recession and predictions of what the impacts of tariffs are going to be. But it is very likely that we are going to see more downside. I think a peak to trough fall of 15 to 20% this year is not out of the question. But it's important to keep in mind that volatility in share markets is absolutely normal. There are going to be up and down days. Yep. It's not. There are. If you look at the number of positive days and negative days on the share market, it's actually 50-50. But over the years, there are more positive years than negative years. And over decades in Australia, it's like 95% positive years rather than negative years. So a longer-term approach is obviously warranted. I know for retirees that's obviously quite difficult.
Well, because they're relying on the income now.
Absolutely. But in those types of situations, it would be up to the individual to make sure that they're comfortable with their investments in their particular funds and to understand that inherently share markets are very volatile.
Amelia, you've recently been in the US. I mean, there is a real palpable fear that they will hit recession now, right?
Yeah, you can feel it in the air. One theory that's doing the rounds in Washington is that Trump is willing to inflict this pain that's going to happen in the US to American consumers, and which, by the way, is going to fall disproportionately on poor Americans, and the richer ones are going to get tax cuts in the House budget that's just passed, because he doesn't have to face the electorate again until 2026 when the midterms happen. And just before that happens, he can then bring in some tax cuts that will maybe make people forget the pain they've been through in the last 2 years. So I'm not hanging out anytime soon for him to say, you know what, I was wrong on the tariffs, I'm dialing them all back. I don't think that's going to happen.
That's interesting you say that, because there is a few counter theories on this one that perhaps he is a bit spooked by what's going on in the markets, and he doesn't really like being unpopular when it comes to, look, what did I hear one American person on one of my many podcasts say? He likes rich people to like him, so this wouldn't be.
It's traditionally previously taken the strength of Wall Street as one of his things. Now he's moved back away from that, and he's actually started to look at the 10-year bond yield as his thing. But the American economy over the last 5 years or so has been one of the strongest economies in the world, strongest productivity growth. The share market's been strong. The US has got tech leadership in all those big tech stocks, including AI and NVIDIA. So they've been a really strong economy. They've just had an inflation breakout, which has squeezed living standards. And now the tech boom has had a bit of a correction. The overall share market has come back about 10%. The economy might be, for the reasons Amelia says, it could slow down now, and it could go through down through a down phase. One of the interesting things was the Australian super funds, led by the industry funds, just within the past month have been in the US, and they went to Washington. It's fascinating what you can see the video of it, and they had at the Australian Embassy there with Kevin Rudd and the US Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent was talking there, and he praised the industry super funds, but they all came out and said, we're going to win. We think what's going on in the US is great, and we're going to put more of Australian superannuation money into the US because they're getting so much money it's spilled over what the Australian share market can absorb. So they're looking elsewhere and they're putting more of it into the US. So that'll be interesting to see how that goes.
Smart?
Yeah, well, I've got to say, a month ago, when I was having the opportunity to meet with a lot of the people who are managing our money, both for the New South Wales government and for Australian superannuants, and we got told, word for word, the best thing I got told is the reason why the US is sucking in so much money is because the US has the cleanest, dirtiest shirt in the world. That is, we are, compared to the rest of Europe, which is not doing particularly well economically and elsewhere, it is still a place that is engendering higher levels of economic growth, which is why it's sucking up a lot of the world's capital. I would simply make the point, though, that the US markets have been priced for perfection. Everything has to go right in order to sustain the values that people are ascribing to these assets, which is why I think there's a lot of nervousness around shock. And that's why I think President Trump is going to have to calibrate that. I agree with Stutch when he says, I think they're paying more attention to the bond market than they are to the share market.
Interesting. I agree with Stutch. There you go. We've heard it here tonight.
If I can make a quick comment there, PK, because I agree with, as an ex-bond trader and financial markets trader, markets never go up. They go up and down, so I don't think we need to be too concerned about that. But I agree with the analysis. Trump wants to be loved, and I think if the market goes down, and there's lots of people in the States, remember, that are not pro-tariffs, that, you know, believe in the low tariff free trading system. Trump hasn't surrounded himself with them, but they'll get a louder noise if the markets stay down or keep going further, and he won't like that. And maybe there might be a silver lining in that.
Amelia, you disagree?
I have to say that the Republican political machine in the US has completely reoriented itself recently around the idea that there is a recession that is coming, that is necessary, that is required to detoxify the economy. I don't think that's a technical term that Diana would know, but that's the term that they're pushing on America.
It is. It's the sort of, we must burn the house down so we can build our new one, right? Wow. Sounds stressful. Now let's hear from Morgan Burnside.
Hello.
Hi, Morgan.
As the government develops their response to both the housing crisis and the climate crisis, has consideration been given to the effects of floodplain development on the existing residents of Australia's flood-affected areas?
Me first, PK.
Yeah, well, who would have thought?
As the member, thank you for the question. As a member who takes in Lismore, this is a topic dear to my heart. But having said that, people always say to me, you know, why are you building there? I've got to remind people, Lismore was built on the floodplain in the 1800s, as was the CBD. So the solution for my region, or a part of my region at least, is mitigation. People always we spend a lot of money, you'd know the stat, Daniel, but I think it's something like 90% on recovery and 10% on prevention in regard to disasters, and we need to switch that around. So the study's been done for my region about a flood mitigation plan. I think you'll find that, you know, most councils have rules around not building on floodplains because, you know, we've had enough of them. So with our situation, that's not the issue. It's an historical issue, and mitigation is our answer for us.
Morgan, you're from a flood-affected area. How has it affected you?
Well, a lot of my childhood schooling was interrupted by long periods of flooding, but I think the issue goes beyond just local councils. I think you know, a council upstream can raise up a floodplain covered in concrete. That water still has to go somewhere. So I think it needs to be more of a state government or federal government response, sort of, you know, standardised plan about how to protect people downstream from these developed areas, which I agree. You know, mitigation is very important. Mitigation across the whole board, not just council LGA by LGA.
And where did you grow up?
In the Hawkesbury area.
Right.
So the Hawkesbury independent floodplain, very, you know, regular floods, unfortunately.
So educated yourself at home, right?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
First-hand experience.
Yeah, no, Kevin's right about Lismore, and I've got to shout out to Kevin and all the North Coast affected communities in New South Wales.
Well, you have had a rough week, there's no doubt about it. Yeah,
and after a rough couple of years as well. And so this has to be bipartisan in terms of how we handle this issue, but we should not be building on floodplains. And I know you're from the Hawkesbury, and this is a very important issue for the Hawkesbury, Nepean flood valleys. I know it is for lots of river-affected communities across Australia. Here in New South Wales, we don't want to be building on the Hawkesbury Nepean floodplain. In fact, at the last election, we had a big debate about whether or not you expand the dam. And a big policy change we took was we think that there are better investments to make. And we thought the previous government's policy was about whether or not you could be putting housing on the floodplain. We didn't think that was the right approach. That's why we took a very different direction. We do have to manage New South Wales's water security and Sydney's, but we don't think the future is stronger if we continue to double down on mistakes.
OK, we want to hear now from Kim Krishenko in the Gold Coast.
Good evening, Patricia. We live here on the Gold Coast in the beautiful hinterland. We were recently without power for 10 days. Energex did a fantastic job reconnecting almost 500,000 houses. We were lucky enough to have a gas cooktop, so we were able to cook meals. My question to the panel is, why are some governments here in Australia so intent on forcing new builds to have electric or induction appliances?
Who's going to take that one first?
Well, there's a lot of anomalies here with this. I mean, I'm going to just segue, PK.
Because that was Queensland, yeah.
That was Queensland, but with the, I'm going to look, I mean, gas is a transition fuel and gas needs to be in the system for a long time as we segue from coal to whether it be nuclear or renewables or nuclear and renewables. But I want to make this point that Zali Steggall, and I understand where she's coming from. There was a climate change group who wanted to walk their talk in Warringah and put 6 hectares of solar panels and 6 wind turbines on North Head, right? Now, Zali, I think, quite rightly said, look, that's not culturally or environmentally sensitive for that area. Fair enough, I understand that. But then we're going to get 60 million solar panels in regional Australia and 20,000 wind turbines if we go on the policy at the moment, which I think is very unreasonable when we raise concerns about the environmental...
All right, Zali's not here to defend herself, to have that one out. We'll invite you, Zali. I feel like I'm not bad on the broader issue of electrification and what happened there.
Yeah, I mean, look, there are some state governments that are saying that all future houses won't have gas. That's not an approach we're adopting in New South Wales. We certainly are saying that we want to build to 7-star energy efficient standards. We do think that that's a long-term good decision for New South Wales and also is what consumers are asking for. We do need to make sure that our building industry can respond to those standards. But we certainly make the point that people do cook on gas in order to allow this transition to take place over time. There's frankly bigger things we can do to help curb climate emissions than necessarily mandating a ban on kitchen gas. I will leave other governments to speak for themselves. Each government is taking a pragmatic view on this. From our perspective, we think you can both build energy efficient housing and also make sure that we transition the existing stock to a more energy efficient future gradually and over time.
All right. Now, before we finish the show tonight, some of this conversation has been kind of heavy, some would say. We're talking tariff wars, we're talking possibly real wars. So we want to look for an upside increasingly, and I feel like there is a lot of gloom. So I'm going to start with you, Stutchbury. Michael Stutchbury, sorry, he used to be my editor. So what's positive?
It's a bit techie, but productivity as a word, we've been really stuck with productivity at 2016 levels in Australia. It's been a slowdown pretty much around the world, not so much in the US. Is what can be done to get productivity up so that we can increase wages, increase standard of livings. Maybe the one bright outlook there is the AI revolution, which is sort of an exciting thing. We're in the early stages of it. It means we'll have to be doing different things, and people sometimes don't like to change, and sometimes jobs will change and so forth. But I think it is something that can really change our world, and hopefully for the better.
Treasurer?
Yeah, I think the upside of all the turbulence is that it will mean that I think Australia and New South Wales certainly will look more within for economic growth. And we will look to see how do we get our economic growth up from the 1.25% back to 2.5%. That does mean it's a productivity question, but it also means making sure that we're making the critical investments we need for the state's future and for the nation's future. And I do think that that is going to be a pretty strong part of our economic response to all this turbulence. We will look for new trading partners, but we are also going to look to see how do we make sure that the Australian economy is creating its own sources of growth to create jobs that pay well for people.
Amelia?
So I think it's always good to know where you stand in a relationship, in any relationship. And I think that what this moment is bringing to middle powers like Australia is clarity. The moment where Trump and Zelensky met in the Oval Office and had a pretty tough conversation showed a lot of countries that had relied on the US for many decades that they do have to chart a bit of their own course going forward. That's especially true for countries of a size like Australia, South Korea, these kinds of countries. So I think that the clarity that this moment brings is maybe not such a bad thing strategically.
Kevin?
I love this country, and I think we're a great country and a great people. So I always have optimism because of who and what we are. We're also blessed with a lot of, as Kevin Rudd said, we're a periodic table. I think that gives us a lot of advantages as well. So I always have great future. We have a sort of a thing within our spirit that we want to have a go. I think government sometimes has a problem with that. But look, I think we have a great future because of the country we are and the people we are.
Yeah, look, I'm going to give you one too. This is a very attractive country. It's pretty amazing to live here, honestly. Our own island, how good is that? I mean, like, really, we are having quite a good time mostly here. So thank you very much for a great conversation. Michael Stutchbury, Daniel Mookhey and Amelia Lester and Kevin Hogan. And thank you for your questions, for driving the conversation. Next week, I'll be with you from Melbourne, where we'll ask what should be in the pre-election budget. It will be Budget Eve. Can you believe we're having a budget? The panel will include Allegra Spender, Adam Crichton, Sean Kelly and Angela Jackson. Head to our website to register to be in the Melbourne audience. Thanks again. I'll see you next week.